The worst thing about having a gift was that it never let her pretend. Molly had tried. When she was younger, she used to press her palms flat against the cold stone of her father's cottage and force her mind to go still, to feel nothing, to know nothing, to simply be a girl who ground herbs and changed linen bandages without seeing what the herbs would eventually fail to cure. It never worked. Her hands always knew. The warmth that gathered in her fingers whenever she touched something living was not a comfort. It was a sentence. She had learned to work around it. She had learned to smile at patients without letting them see what her hands had already told her. She had learned to be useful and small and unremarkable. And she had learned, above all else, never to mention what she was to anyone who served Lord Cadric of Velmore. That particular lesson had cost her more than she cared to remember. It was the 3rd week of the harvest moon, when the wounded wolf was brought to her door. Molly had been awake since before dawn, as she usually was. The curandera's cottage sat at the eastern edge of the village of Ashven, where the cobblestones gave way to mud and the shadows of the great pines began. It was the kind of place that people found only when they needed something they were too ashamed to seek in daylight. A tincture for a cough that had gone on too long. A poultice for a wound someone didn't want the Lord's guard to notice. A quiet word from a woman who knew things without being told. The hearth was burning low. The smell of dried yarrow and pine resin hung in the air, mingled with the faint sweetness of beeswax candles she kept lit through the night. Her gray cloak hung on the hook beside the door, still damp from the rain she'd walked through the evening before. On the wooden table at the center of the room, she had arranged her tools with the careful order of someone who trusted routine more than hope. Clean linen strips, a clay pot of drawing salve, her bone-handled knife, a bowl of boiled water already beginning to cool. She was rebraiding her long blonde hair when the banging started. 3 heavy blows. Urgent. Uneven. She crossed the room without hurrying. Urgency at a curandera's door was common enough to no longer frighten her, and lifted the latch. There were 2 of them outside, both large, both dressed in road-worn traveling cloaks without insignia, which immediately told her something. Men who had insignia to wear, but chose not to wear it, were either deserters, or they were hiding something more important than their names. Between them, barely upright, was a 3rd man. Molly's eyes moved to him, the way her hands always moved to a wound, before she consciously decided to touch it. Pulled there by something older than thought. He was very tall. Even slumped between the 2 men supporting his weight. He was tall enough that his head nearly brushed the top of her doorframe. His hair was long and black, worn in thick braids that had come partially loose, strands of it dark against the pale skin of his neck. His face, what she could see of it through the rain-soaked tangle of hair, was sharp-featured, squared at the jaw, and deeply unwell. His lips were the color of winter ashes. A long diagonal wound crossed his left side, visible where his leather armor had been partially cut away, and the linen pressed over it was soaked through. The smell of blood reached her before she had even opened the door fully. But it was his hands that made her pause. They were clenched. Even now, barely conscious, he was holding himself. Not clutching at his companions, not gripping the doorframe, just holding his own posture together through sheer terrifying will. "He needs help," said the shorter of the 2 men. His voice was tight, controlled. "Now." Molly stepped back. "Bring him in." She did not ask what had happened. She never did. The wound would tell her. They got him through the door and onto the narrow cot along the wall, and the frame protested under his weight in a way that made Molly briefly concerned for the structural integrity of her furniture. She took her candle from the table and held it close. The wound was deep. Not a blade wound, or not only a blade wound. There was something beneath the torn skin that her eye couldn't quite account for, a bruised wrongness that she had seen only once before, in a man who had survived a silver-tipped bolt. Her stomach tightened. Silver poisoning moved fast in a shifter. She set the candle aside and reached for the bowl of water. "One of you hold the light," she said. The taller man moved immediately to obey. She noted that without turning. A man who obeyed a woman's instruction without hesitation in a curandera's cottage was either someone with sense or someone too frightened to argue. Either was useful. She peeled the soaked linen away from the wound, and she made herself breathe evenly, because the first rule of treating someone whose life depended on your steadiness was that you did not show them your fear. The wound was bad, but it was not yet fatal. Silver poisoning took time in the strong, and this man, whatever else he was strong. She could feel it even through the crisis of his body, the way she always felt the fundamental nature of a living thing through her hands. A deep, banked fire that hadn't gone out, despite everything working to extinguish it. She began to clean the wound. The man on the cot made no sound. That was somehow more unnerving than if he had cried out. "How long has he been like this?" she asked. "Since before nightfall," said the shorter man. He refused to stop writing. Molly said nothing. She was working her fingers along the edges of the wound with focused care, drawing out what she could feel of the silver the way her father had taught her, gently, with the kind of patience that was almost painful, because rushing it caused the poison to scatter. Her fingertips had gone warm, the way they always did when she was working, and she kept her expression still so that neither of these men would notice anything unusual about what she was doing. "He's going to need to stay through the night," she said. "The silver needs to be fully drawn before I close the wound, or it will fester." Silence. Then the shorter man said, in a voice stripped of everything except raw animal fear, "He can't die." Molly looked up then, just briefly. The man's eyes were fixed on the figure on the cot, and in them she saw something that surprised her. Not the fear of a servant losing a master, but something older and more desperate. The fear of a man watching someone who mattered to him bleed. "I know," she said. She turned back to the wound. She worked for an hour, the cottage filled with the sharp smell of the drawing salve and the clean smoke of pine resin, and outside, the rain continued, and the wind pushed at the shutters, and the only sound inside was the low crackle of the fire and Molly's quiet, steady breathing. At some point, the man on the cot came back to partial consciousness. She knew before she looked up. She felt it in the shift of his body, the slight tension that moved through him as awareness returned. She kept her eyes on her work. "Don't move," she said. "I'm not finished." A pause. Then, low and slightly roughened. "Where am I?" "Ashfen, the curandera's cottage." She pressed the clean linen against the now sealed wound with deliberate firmness. "You're safe. Stay still." Another pause. Longer. "You're not afraid of me." It wasn't a question. It was said with a particular kind of quiet weight, as if it surprised him, as if the absence of her fear was itself something remarkable. Molly lifted her eyes then for the first time and looked directly at him. His eyes were open. They were the color of deep water under ice, a pale and startling blue that was sharp even in the dim candlelight, even through the exhaustion and pain dulling every other part of his face. He was watching her with the focused stillness of something that was, beneath the wound and the fever-pale skin, fundamentally and completely in control of itself. She held his gaze without looking away. "You're the patient," she said simply. "Fear doesn't help either of us." The blue eyes stayed on her for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then he said nothing more, and she went back to her work, and the fire burned, and the rain fell, and neither of them spoke again until the first gray light of dawn began to press through the shuttered windows. Molly tied off the last strip of linen, sat back on her stool, and let out a breath so quiet it was almost nothing. He was going to live. She didn't yet know what that would cost her. She should have asked his name. That was the thought that came to Molly the following morning, when she woke with a crick in her neck from sleeping upright on the stool beside the hearth and found the cot empty. The linen she had used was folded, not discarded, not left in the careless heap that most patients left behind. Folded, with the precise economy of someone who had been trained to leave no trace. The drawing salve she had applied through the night had soaked through the outer bandage in the expected places, which meant he had truly rested at some point, which meant his body had accepted the treatment. That was good. The bowl of water she had left on the small table beside the cot was empty. Also good. But he was gone, and she still did not know his name. She stood in the center of the cottage, her gray cloak wrapped around her shoulders against the morning chill, and looked at the folded linen for a long moment. Then she set water to boil over the hearth, ground dried chamomile between her palms, and told herself it did not matter. Patience came. Patience left. The ones who lived went back to their lives, and did not often think about the woman in the cottage at the edge of the village who had saved them. That was the nature of her work. She had learned not to expect gratitude. She had learned not to expect much of anything. That particular lesson had come from Lord Cadric. She pressed her back teeth together and ground the chamomile harder. Cadric of Velmore was not a cruel man in the way that stories described cruel men. He did not shout or strike. He smiled a great deal, actually. A wide, practiced smile that reached his eyes just convincingly enough that Molly had spent 2 years believing it. He had taken her in after her father's death, when she was 22 and alone, and the cottage in Ashvin had been the only thing left between her and the road. He had spoken about her gift with something that sounded like respect. He had given her a room in the manor house, fine linen to sleep on, candles instead of tallow. He had told her, and she had believed, because she had needed so badly to believe, that she was valued. She had not understood, until it was nearly too late, that Cadric valued her the way a man valued a tool. Precisely, carefully, and without any concern for what the tool itself might feel about the arrangement. The letter had not been meant for her to find. She had gone to the manor's storeroom for fresh herbs. The lavender had run low, and the curandera's work never paused for winter. And the folded parchment had been on the floor beneath the shelving, dropped there by some careless hand. She had picked it up, intending to return it. She had seen her own name in the first line, and had gone very still. The Omega Curandera is not to know that her gift has been registered with the High Council. When the delegation arrives for the Solstice Summit, she is to be presented as a tribute, a working Omega seer healer of documented ability. Lord Farron has offered considerable territory in exchange. If she resists, remind her of the brother. She had read it 3 times. Each time, the words rearranged themselves in her mind, and still came out the same. If she resists, remind her of the brother. Her brother Eden, who was 17, and had been sent by Cadric's recommendation to train with a garrison 2 territories north. Her brother Eden, who wrote her letters that arrived slightly too infrequently, in handwriting that was slightly too careful, about a life that was slightly too vague. Her brother, who had not written in 4 months. She had stood in that storeroom with the letter in her hands, and felt the floor of everything she had believed tilt violently beneath her feet. The warmth in her palms, the same warmth that told her when a living thing was failing, had risen sharp and nauseating, and for a moment she had thought she might be sick. Then she had folded the letter very carefully, put it in the pocket of her work apron, and walked back to her cottage as if nothing had happened. That had been 6 days ago. She had not slept properly since. Now she stood at her work table in the gray morning light and stared at the empty bowl where the blue-eyed wolf had drunk water, and tried to think clearly about what she had left. The Solstice Summit was 11 days away. Lord Farron's territory was 3 days' ride to the south. She had never met him, but she knew his name. Everyone in the 3 territories knew his name. He was a beta lord with alpha-sized ambitions and a reputation for acquiring omegas the way other men acquired livestock, with a detached administrative brutality that was all the more frightening for being entirely legal within the High Council's frameworks. She had no horse, no coin, no family name that carried weight anywhere. She had her hands, her knowledge, and 11 days, and she had a letter that named Cadric as a man who trafficked in people, which she was not yet certain was enough. The knock at the door came just as she was pouring boiling water over the chamomile. She set the clay pot down carefully before she answered it. Cadric's men knocked differently than Patience. Heavier, with the particular rhythm of people who did not expect to wait. This knock was neither. It was measured. 3 raps, evenly spaced. The knock of someone who had been raised to understand that a door was a boundary. She opened it. The taller of the 2 men from the previous night stood on her threshold. In the morning light, she could see him properly for the first time. Broad-shouldered, older than she had initially judged, with a soldier's posture and a scar that crossed his left brow. He was dressed in the same dark traveling cloak, still without insignia, and he was carrying something. A pouch. Leather, well-made, heavy. "For the treatment," he said. Molly looked at the pouch. "I didn't ask for payment." "I know." He held it out without retracting it. He insisted. Something moved through her at that, a small unwanted warmth that she immediately set aside. "Tell him it wasn't necessary." "With respect," said the man, with the faint ghost of something that might have been amusement. "He's not particularly easy to tell things." Molly looked at him for a moment. Then she took the pouch, because she was not so proud that she would be foolish about it, and the weight of it in her hands was more coin than she had seen in 6 months. She held herself very still so that nothing showed on her face. "He's well?" she asked, recovered enough to be angry about the delay. A pause. "He wants to know if there is anything you require." The question was so unexpected that for a moment she simply stared at the man. Anything you require. She had been living for 2 years in a situation designed to ensure she required nothing she wasn't permitted to have. The idea that someone was asking, genuinely asking in open terms, was so foreign that her mind went briefly, absurdly blank. Then it went to the letter in her apron pocket. Then it went to Eden, and the 4 months of silence, and the garrison 2 territories north. "No," she said. "Thank you." The man nodded. He turned to go. "Wait." He stopped. Molly held the door frame with one hand, and looked at the mud of the village path, and thought about the 11 days she had left, and the coin now in her hand, and the absolute insufficiency of both. "The man you brought last night," she said carefully. "He would know. A man like that would know, if someone had been taken, if someone was being held." A silence. When she looked up, the soldier's face had changed, not alarmed, more attentive, in the way of someone who was deciding how much to reveal. "What kind of someone?" he asked. "A young man, 17, sent north to a garrison under Lord Cadrick's recommendation 4 months ago. No letters since." She kept her voice even. "I need to know if he's alive." The soldier looked at her for a long moment. "I'll carry the question," he said. He left before she could ask what that meant. Molly closed the door and stood with her back against the wood and let herself shake, just for a moment, in the privacy of the empty cottage. The chamomile was going cold. The folded linen sat on the cot. The pouch of coin was heavy in her fist. Outside, the village of Ashfen was beginning its morning. Cartwheels in mud, a dog barking somewhere near the well, the smell of bread from the baker's chimney drifting faintly across the cold air. 11 days. She straightened. She crossed to the table. She began to plan. The coin lasted 3 days before Cadrick's men came to collect it. She had not been foolish enough to leave it in the cottage. The morning after the soldier's visit, Molly had wrapped the pouch in oilcloth and pressed it into the hollow beneath the loose flagstone behind the hearth. The same place her father had kept his seed money, the same place she had kept the letter. When the 2 guardsmen arrived at her door on the 4th day, moving through her things with the practiced indifference of men who believed everything they touched already belonged to their lord, they found nothing but herbs, linen, and the quiet face of a woman who had learned long ago how to be looked through. "Lord Cadrick asks that you present yourself at the manor this evening," said the elder of the 2. He was not looking at her when he said it. He was looking at her shelves. "For what purpose?" she asked. "The solstice preparations require your assistance." He finally looked at her, and his expression carried the particular blankness of a man delivering a message he had not been invited to question. "He expects you before the evening bell." They left. Molly stood at the center of her cottage and counted her breaths until she trusted herself to move. 7 days until the solstice summit. She went to the flagstone. She counted the coin. Enough to buy passage on a merchant's cart. Enough to eat for 2 weeks on the road. Not nearly enough to ransom a boy from a garrison if he was being held rather than trained. She wrapped it back in the oilcloth. She put the letter beside it. She pressed the flagstone flat and stood up and looked at the door. She could run. The thought arrived with perfect clarity, stripped of the guilt that usually accompanied it. She could leave before the evening bell, take the eastern road, and be beyond Velmore's borders before Cadric thought to send riders after her. She was not pack-bound. She had no formal contract. The arrangement between them had always been spoken, implied, woven from obligation and dependency, and the threat of what would happen to Eden if she proved difficult. But Eden. She couldn't run without knowing. She was still standing there, thinking about her brother's careful handwriting, growing more careful with each letter until it stopped entirely, when the second knock came. It was not Kedric's knock. It was 3 measured raps. She crossed the room so quickly that she nearly knocked the clay pot from the table. The soldier, she had begun to think of him simply as the soldier, since she still didn't know his name, stood on her threshold. But this time he was not alone, and he was not carrying a payment pouch. Behind him, half visible in the gray afternoon light, stood 2 others she didn't recognize. And behind them, further back, at the edge of the tree line where the village path disappeared into the pines, a figure on horseback waited with the absolute stillness of someone who had chosen exactly how much to be seen. Molly looked past the soldier to the tree line. Even at that distance, she knew him. There was something about the way he sat that was not quite the same as the way other men sat on horseback. A quality of settled authority, as if the horse and the road and the gray afternoon had all arranged themselves around him rather than the other way around. The blue eyes found hers across the distance. He did not move. "He received your question," the soldier said quietly. "About the young man." Her breath caught. "And the garrison you described, Lord Cadric's northern garrison at Edgeholm, was audited by the Crown's riders 8 weeks ago. It was found to be holding 6 individuals without formal indenture contracts." A pause. "One of them matches the description of your brother." The world went very slightly sideways. She put her hand on the doorframe. "He's alive," she said. It was barely a question. "He was alive at the time of the audit." The soldier's voice was careful. "He is currently under Crown protection, pending investigation into Lord Cadric's holding practices." Crown protection. Those were not small words. Those were words that required a very particular kind of authority to deploy. The kind that sat on horseback at the edge of tree lines and watched Curandera's doors with pale blue eyes. Molly looked back toward the tree line. The figure had not moved. She pulled her gray cloak from the hook and stepped outside. The soldier moved to accompany her. She walked past him without stopping, down the mud path, past the 2 men she didn't know, toward the tree line. The air smelled of pine resin and coming rain, cold and sharp in her lungs. She stopped 5 feet from the horse. Up close, he looked better than he had on her cot. Color returned to his face, the fever pallor replaced by something harder and more composed. The black braids were ordered again, pulled back and bound with a worn leather cord. He wore a dark riding cloak over the leather armor, and the only evidence of the wound she had spent a night closing was a slight careful stillness in how he held his left side when the horse shifted beneath him. He was watching her with the same quality of attention she had noticed in the cottage, not staring, observing. As if she were a text he was reading with great patience and no intention of being wrong about. "You didn't tell me your name," she said. "You didn't ask. I'm asking now." A pause. Something moved behind his eyes. Not quite amusement, not quite gravity. somewhere between the two. Orion, he said. Just the name. No title, no house. Molly noted that and filed it. You found out about my brother very quickly, she said, for a man without insignia. I have long reach. Clearly. She crossed her arms beneath her cloak, because her hands were not entirely steady, and she preferred not to advertise that. Lord Cadric intends to present me at the Solstice Summit as a tribute to Lord Farron. I have 7 days. I have evidence, a letter, with Cadric's intent written in his own secretary's hand. She held his gaze. I don't know what you are or who you serve, but you found my brother in 8 weeks when I couldn't find him in 4 months, and that tells me you have resources I don't have. So I am asking you, plainly, without pretense, whether you can help me. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It had the quality of a decision being made carefully by someone who was not in the habit of making careless ones. Show me the letter, Orion said. She went back to the cottage. She lifted the flagstone. She brought out the oilcloth and unfolded it and handed the letter up to him. He read it once. His expression did not change, but his jaw set in a way that was different from before. A specific tightening, controlled and cold. He folded the letter and looked down at her. How many patients have you treated in Cadric's name? He asked. She frowned. What do you mean? Men and women brought to you, treated by you, on Cadric's instruction. His voice was even. Were you kept informed of what happened to them afterward? The cold that moved through her was not from the wind. She thought of the patients she had treated over 2 years, the ones brought by Cadric's guardsmen, rather than arriving on their own. The ones she had healed with focused care, using the warmth in her hands to draw out infection or silver or bone fever, and then watched be escorted back to the manor. The ones she had never seen again. No, she said slowly. I was not. I thought not. He looked at the letter again, then at her. Cadric has been selling healed omegas to 3 separate lords for 2 years. Not just you. You were the most valuable because of your gift, but you were not the only one. He handed the letter back. The Crown has been building a case. The Solstice Summit was always the intended moment. It gathers all 3 lords in one place, under treaty terms that allow for arrest without the usual territorial complications. Molly stared at him. You already knew, she said. Before I said anything. You already knew about Cadric. I knew about the network. I did not know about you specifically. Something shifted in his expression, almost imperceptible. Until my men brought me to your door. The rain began then, soft and cold, stippling the mud around her boots. Neither of them moved. The letter, she said. You need it. It confirms what we know in Cadric's own words. It would accelerate the case significantly. He paused. But I am not asking you to hand it over without something in return. Molly looked up at him. What are you offering? Your brother released to you directly, within 2 days, verified by my own writer. He held her gaze. Safe passage out of Velmore. Crown protection for yourself until the summit concludes, and Cadric is formally charged. And after the summit? After the summit, Cadric will not be in a position to threaten you or anyone in your family again. She stood in the beginning rain and looked at this man who had given her a name with no title and healed too fast for anything ordinary. And she thought about the folded linen on her cot and the pouch of coin beneath her flagstone and the 7 days she had been counting like a prisoner, counting walls. She thought about Eden's careful handwriting going silent. She held out the letter. 2 days, she said, and I want to see him myself before I agree to anything else. Orion took the letter. His fingers didn't brush hers. He was precise about that, she noticed. He took the corner of the parchment she wasn't holding, with the economy of a man who understood exactly what space meant to a woman in her position. 2 days, he said. He turned his horse. The soldier fell into step. The two unfamiliar men followed. Molly stood in the rain and watched them disappear into the pines, and felt, for the first time in 6 days, something that was not quite hope, but was at least the shape of it. She went back inside. She did not go to the manor that evening. Eden arrived on the second morning, exactly as promised. Molly heard the horses before she saw them. 4 sets of hooves on the village path, moving at a careful pace, the kind of pace that meant someone in the group was not entirely well. She had the door open before the knock came. Her brother was thinner. That was the first thing she saw, and it hit her somewhere beneath the ribs, with a force that had nothing to do with surprise and everything to do with the particular cruelty of seeing someone beloved diminished. He was 17 and had always been slight, with their father's pale coloring and a quiet seriousness that had made him seem older than his years. Now he seemed younger, stripped back, uncertain, moving with the careful deliberateness of someone whose body had recently reminded him of its limits. But he was upright. He was walking. His eyes, when they found hers, were the same gray she remembered. She crossed the space between them without deciding to. He let her hold him for a long moment without saying anything. She felt him exhale against her shoulder, a slow, careful release, like a fist finally unclenching. "I'm all right," he said into her cloak. "Molly, I'm all right." She pulled back and looked at his face, and decided not to argue with him about it. Later. There would be time later. "Come inside," she said. "You need food and warmth, and you need to tell me everything." But not in that order. One of the 4 riders, a young guardsman with a crown rider's insignia on his cloak, the first insignia she had seen on any of Orion's people, dismounted to help with the horses. The others waited. Molly brought Eden inside and set water over the hearth and sliced bread and pressed him into the chair closest to the fire and sat across from him on her stool and waited. He told her about the garrison in pieces, about arriving to find it nothing like what Kadrick had described, not a training post, but a holding facility, more guarded than garrisoned, with rules about movement and correspondence that had become clear to him only gradually. About the letters that had been intercepted and rewritten before being sent. About the 6 of them held there. Not prisoners in chains, because chains would have been too obvious. But prisoners nonetheless, their freedoms narrowed so slowly and so carefully that by the time Eden understood the shape of it, the walls had been there for months. Molly listened to all of it with her hands flat on her knees, and her expression still, because if she let herself feel the full weight of it right now, she would not be useful to either of them. "The crown riders came without warning," Eden said. 8 of them. The garrison commander didn't even have time to move us before they were inside. He looked at his hands. "One of the riders told me it was an ongoing investigation, that someone with authority had flagged our location specifically." He paused. "Was that you?" "Someone helped me," she said. Eden looked up. He was perceptive, had always been, a quality that had made him their father's favorite and Kedrick's inconvenience. He looked at her face, and then at the door, and then back at her, and she could see him assembling something from the pieces available to him. "Who?" he asked. "I don't entirely know yet," she said honestly. She went to Orion that afternoon. Not because he had summoned her. He hadn't. But because she had Eden back and the letter delivered in 5 days until the Solstice Summit, and she needed to understand the rest of the plan before she could decide how much of it she trusted. The soldier, whose name she had finally learned was Bren, met her at the edge of the pines, and led her along a track she hadn't known existed, narrow and needle-carpeted, deeper into the forest than the village ever went. The camp, when she reached it, was nothing like what she might have imagined. No banners, no grand pavilion. A cluster of dark tents set against the tree line with the kind of deliberate invisibility that spoke of long practice. Horses picketed in a rope corral. A fire burning low and scentless. Men moving quietly, without excess. Orion was at a campaign table outside the largest tent, bent over a spread of parchment maps with 2 other men. He straightened when she approached. The two men stepped back without being told. She noticed things she had not allowed herself to notice before. The way the other men moved around him, not afraid, not obsequious, but careful. The way they angled their bodies, without appearing to, so that he was never fully exposed. The way the camp itself was arranged, she now realized, with him at its center, and layers of awareness around him, like rings in water. "Your brother arrived safely," he said. "Yes." She stopped at the other side of the table. The map showed the 3 territories, Velmore, Farron's lands, and a third she recognized as Dunmore. The Solstice Summit location was marked in the center with a heavy seal. "I want to know the full plan, not the version you gave me in the rain to get me to hand over the letter. The real one." Something in his expression shifted, not defensively, more like recalibration. "What makes you think they're different?" he asked. "Because you gave me exactly enough to secure my cooperation, and not one detail more," she said. "Which was smart. I would have done the same. But Eden is here now, and Kedrick's men will notice I didn't come to the manor, which means I have perhaps 2 days before someone is sent to collect me by force rather than invitation. So I need to know what happens at the summit." A pause. He looked at her with the same patient, reading quality she had noticed on the first night. Then he turned one of the maps toward her. "Kedrick, Farron, and Lord Dunmore will all be present at the summit. The Crown's case against them is built on the network, the buying and selling of Omegas across territorial lines, in violation of High Council statutes that have existed for 40 years, but have never been enforced against lords of their rank." His finger moved along the map. "Your letter provides the written link between all 3. Without it, the case was circumstantial. With it, the High Council's arbiter can authorize formal arrest on the summit grounds, where no lord's territorial immunity applies." "And the people already sold?" she asked. "The ones before me?" "Traced where possible, returned where alive." His voice didn't change, but something behind it did. "Not all were." The words landed quietly and stayed. "How long has this been happening?" she asked. "In some form, across various lords, for over a decade." He met her eyes. "The network grew more organized in the last 3 years. Kedrick's involvement specifically, 2 years, which aligns with when he offered you protection. She had walked into it believing she was being saved. She had been inventory. The warmth in her palms rose suddenly, sharp and unwelcome, and she pressed her hands flat against the edge of the table to quiet it. She stared at the map, at the summit seal, at the neat, brutal geometry of 3 lords arranging lives like territory on parchment. "I want to be there," she said. Orion went still. "At the summit," she clarified. "When the arbiter moves, I want to be present." "It will not be safe." "It wasn't safe when I was standing in Kedrick's storeroom reading a letter that described me as tribute," she said. "I've been unsafe for 2 years without knowing it. I would prefer to be unsafe while watching the men responsible answer for it." The silence stretched. She had expected argument, or the particular kind of dismissal that well-meaning men deployed when they had decided a woman's desire for justice was really just an emotional response that needed managing. Orion did neither. "You would need to remain within my guard's perimeter at all times," he said. "Agreed. If the situation deteriorates, you leave. No argument. That depends on the situation." The faintest line appeared at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. Something more restrained than that. "You bargain like someone who's used to being underestimated," he said. "I've had practice." She held his gaze. "Do we have an agreement?" He studied her for a moment. That same quality of careful, unhurried attention that she was beginning to recognize as simply how he looked at things he considered important. "We have an agreement," he said. She nodded. She looked back at the map. "There's something else," she said, "about my gift." She had not spoken of it directly to anyone in 2 years. The word felt strange in her mouth, too large and too exposed. Kedrick knew about it. He had it registered with the High Council without my knowledge. That means there's a record of what I can do, held somewhere I didn't authorize. She looked up. I want that record altered or removed before the summit. If Farron has seen it, he'll know what I am the moment I walk into that room. Orion was quiet for a moment. I can have it removed, he said. But it would require me to explain to you how. And that explanation requires a different conversation. Then we'll have it, she said. He looked at her across the map table, with the low forest light coming through the pine canopy above them, and the camp quiet around them, and the smell of cold resin and leather and wood smoke between them. Tomorrow morning, he said. Come at first light. She left before the shadows grew long, walking back through the pine track with Bren at a respectful distance behind her, turning over everything she now knew. The plan was larger than she had imagined. The danger was more specific. And the man at its center was something she still couldn't fully name. Not what he had seemed. Not what she had assumed. And not finished revealing himself. Back at the cottage, Eden was asleep in the chair by the hearth, wrapped in her spare wool blanket, his face finally loose and young in the firelight. Molly sat across from him and watched him breathe. 4 months of silence. 2 years of captivity she hadn't known she was living. A gift that had been catalogued and sold before she had ever chosen to use it. The anger was there. Clean and cold and entirely clarifying. She let herself feel it. Then she banked the fire, pulled her cloak around her shoulders, and began to prepare for the morning. The conversation at first light lasted longer than either of them had planned. Orion told her everything. Not in pieces, not calibrated for her cooperation. Everything. She understood, sitting across from him at the campaign table, with the cold morning pressing through the pine canopy and 2 clay cups of warmed cider between them, that the decision to tell her was deliberate. He was a man who chose his words with the same precision he applied to everything else, and when he chose to speak fully, it meant he had made a judgment about the person across from him. She was not certain how she felt about being judged, but she listened. He was not simply a man with long reach and crown riders at his disposal. He was the crown. Orion Veilstrom, Alpha King of the 4 territories, the 5th having been absorbed into the crown's direct control 3 years prior, following the exact kind of Lord Network corruption that was now closing around Kedrick and his associates. He had been traveling without insignia because the summit required his presence to be unknown until the moment of formal authority. An Alpha King arriving openly would have given Kedrick time to dissolve the evidence, scatter the network, and retreat behind territorial immunity. The wound had been an ambush. 3 men on the eastern road, silver-tipped bolts, a coordinated attack that suggested someone had known his route. The investigation into who had sold that information was still ongoing. Molly sat with all of this and let it settle. She thought about the man on her cot, barely conscious, refusing to make a sound, folding his own linen before he left. She thought about the coin pouch, and the measured knock, and the way he had taken the corner of the letter she wasn't holding. She thought about what it meant that the most powerful alpha in the 4 territories had been brought half-dead to a village curandera's door and had, in the days following, located her brother, reviewed her situation, and offered her protection before she had even known to ask for it properly. "You could have told me sooner," she said. "Yes," he said. No justification, no deflection. She appreciated that more than she expected to. "The record with the High Council," she said. "You can have it removed because you're the one who authorized it in the first place. The High Council operates under Crown authority. The registry was created without proper consent. Yours was not the only case. I've already ordered a full audit." He met her eyes. "What was done to you and the others was legal only because the laws surrounding Omega registration have not been revised in 60 years. That changes after the summit, formally and permanently." Molly looked at her cider. "That doesn't undo 2 years." "No," he said. It doesn't. The honesty of it was unexpectedly steadying. She looked up. What do you need me to do at the summit? Stand witness, he said. The arbiter will require testimony from someone directly named in the network's documentation. Your letter, combined with your testimony, closes the case against all three lords simultaneously. Without a witness present in person, Kedrick's advocates will argue the letter is forgery. He paused. It will require you to speak in a room full of lords who considered you property. I know what it will require, she said. He nodded. Once. The kind of nod that was not condescension but recognition. The Solstice Summit was held in the Great Hall of Thornwall Keep, a gray stone fortress that sat on neutral ground between the three territories, drafty and vast and smelling of old smoke and tallow. Molly arrived inside Orion's guard perimeter, dressed in a clean linen gown under her gray wool cloak, her blonde hair braided and pinned. She looked. She knew. Exactly like what she was. A village curandera, an omega without rank. She had decided this was useful. Let them see her exactly as they had always seen her. She wanted them to remember what they had thought when they looked at her. She wanted them to remember it while the arbiter read the charges. Kedrick was already in the hall when she entered. He was speaking to one of Farron's men near the far wall, and he did not see her at first. When he did, when his eyes moved across the room and found her face, the color left him with a swiftness that was almost satisfying. Farron, seated at the Lord's table, went still in the way of a man whose calculations had suddenly stopped adding up. Lord Dunmore, older and more careful than the other two, looked at the crown riders positioned at each door, and made a very quiet decision to fold his hands on the table and say nothing. The arbiter, a tall woman in the crown's gray and gold, with the particular sharp patience of someone who had presided over difficult proceedings before, called the hall to order. Molly testified for 20 minutes. She spoke in a clear, even voice without looking away from the arbiter, because looking at Kedrick would have satisfied a feeling that was not useful right now, and looking at Orion, who stood at the edge of the room in his full authority, in the dark armor with the crown's seal at his chest, his black braids ordered and his blue eyes entirely calm, would have done something else to her composure that she also couldn't afford. She spoke about 2 years of work performed under false protection, about the patients she had healed who had subsequently disappeared, about the letter, which the arbiter's aide had already authenticated, about Eden and the garrison, and the careful rewritten letters. When she finished, the hall was very quiet. The arbiter read the formal charges. Kedrick tried to speak twice. The second time, one of the crown riders stepped forward and he stopped. Farron said nothing at all. He had the look of a man who had already begun composing his petition for leniency and knew it was unlikely to be well received. Dunmore, when the charges against him were read, lesser but damning, closed his eyes briefly and then opened them and looked at his folded hands. The formal arrests took less time than the testimony. Molly stood and watched Kedrick be escorted from the hall by 2 of the crown's riders, past the lords who had dined with him and the guardsmen who had served him, and she waited for the satisfaction to arrive in full. It came, but it was quieter than she had expected, less like triumph, and more like the feeling of setting down something very heavy after carrying it for so long that she had forgotten the weight had a name. She exhaled. Around her, the hall began to move. Voices, the scrape of benches, the arbiter conferring with her aides. Molly stood still in the middle of it. A presence settled beside her. She did not need to look. "It's done," Orion said. "I know." She kept her eyes on the door where Kedrick had been taken. "Thank you." A pause. "You did the necessary part. We both did necessary parts." Silence. The hall noise continued around them, separate from the small, still space between them. "What happens to his lands?" she asked. "Velmore." "Held in Crown Trust pending redistribution. The village of Ashven and the surrounding territory will be administered directly for the immediate period." He paused. "The curandera's cottage remains exactly as it is. You are under no obligation to leave it." She turned and looked at him then. He was watching her with that same careful attention. But there was something different in it now. Something that had been present, she realized, from the first night, held under extraordinary control. The blue eyes were steady and serious, and entirely honest in the way that only certain people ever managed to be, the ones for whom honesty was not a policy, but a nature. "You knew," she said slowly, "when your men brought you to my door. You knew what you were to me." The mate bond. She had felt it. She admitted this to herself now, finally, without flinching, from the moment her hands had touched his wound. That warmth, too sharp and too specific to be only her gift, too personal and too pointed to be the neutral warmth of a healer's work. She had set it aside because she had not been safe enough to examine it, because the last 2 years had made her careful about warmth that arrived unexpectedly. "I felt it," he said. "Yes. And you said nothing. You had enough to carry." He held her gaze without wavering. "I had no intention of adding to it until you were ready to hear it without it feeling like another cage." The words arrived and settled somewhere very deep. She thought about everything she had believed about bonds, about the way Kadrick had weaponized connection, had taken the natural desire to be needed and twisted it into a mechanism of control. She thought about how long she had been braced for someone to use what she felt against her. Orion had known for days. He had said nothing. He had given her her brother, and the summit, and the testimony, and had stood at the edge of the room while she did the necessary part. "It doesn't feel like a cage," she said quietly. Something shifted in his face. Not dramatic, not overwhelming. Just the release of something that had been very carefully held. "Good," he said. They were married in the early spring, in a ceremony held at the crown seat, rather than any of the 3 territories, because Molly had no particular attachment to any lord's hall, and a great deal of attachment to the idea that no single lord's territory should define her. Eden stood at her side. He was filling out again. Color returned to his face. The careful guardedness he had brought home from the garrison, gradually loosening over the winter months, as it became clear that he was safe, and the threat was gone. He had been offered a place in the Crown's own training cohort, a real one, structured and honorable, and had accepted with the quiet seriousness that had always been his nature. He squeezed her hand before she walked forward. "Father would have liked him," Eden said. Molly looked at Orion, waiting at the end of the hall in his formal dark attire, watching her with that same patient, particular attention that had been turned on her from the first night in the cottage. "Father liked anyone who folded his own linen," she said. Eden laughed, a real laugh, unheld and sudden, and she carried the sound of it with her as she walked forward. The cottage in Ashfin remained standing. Molly returned to it twice a year, in spring and in autumn, to restock the herbs and check the stores, and make sure the flagstone behind the hearth was still solid. Bren, who had been given a senior post in the Crown's household guard, and accepted it with the same undemonstrative steadiness he applied to everything, arranged her escort without being asked, and declined to accompany her inside on the grounds that a curandera's cottage was not a place for soldiers. She appreciated that. The village of Ashfen had a new curandera now. A young woman Molly had trained through the winter, steady-handed and unsentimental, who had quietly refused 3 separate offers of patronage from lords who had heard about her work. Molly had told her that was the right instinct. The young woman had said she knew. Kadrick stood before the High Council's tribunal in the autumn following the summit. Farron negotiated a reduced sentence in exchange for full cooperation and was stripped of his lordship regardless. Dunmore, whose cooperation had been immediate and complete, retained his title under a crown-supervised arrangement that would last for the remainder of his life, and transfer to no heir he chose. The Omega Registry was formally dissolved by Crown decree in the same season. The revised statutes, 60 years overdue, as Orion had said, took their place. Molly had been asked to review the language before it was sealed. She had made 7 corrections. All 7 were incorporated. On a cold evening in the 2nd year of their marriage, Molly sat in the library of the Crown's seat, with a candle burning low and her hands wrapped around a cup of warmed cider, reading a letter from the young curandera in Ashfin about a particularly stubborn case of bone fever in the village smith. Orion came in without knocking. He never knocked in their own rooms, she had noticed, but always knocked elsewhere, which she had decided was a reasonable distinction, and sat in the chair across from her and stretched his long legs toward the hearth. "Bren says you've been in here since the morning bell," he said. "The bone fever case is interesting. Bren says you haven't eaten." "I was going to." He set a plate on the table beside her without further comment. Bread, soft cheese, dried apple. She looked at it, then at him. He was reading the campaign maps he'd brought in. Always maps. Always something to understand more fully. And he did not look up. But the plate was there. Warm from the kitchen, placed exactly within reach. She looked back at her letter. The candle burned. The fire settled. The maps rustled softly as he turned them. Outside, the winter pressed cold and quiet against the stone walls. And inside, the library smelled of old parchment and pine resin and the faint, clean warmth of two people who had found each other through the worst of circumstances and had chosen, consciously and without reservation, to remain. Molly reached for the bread. Her hands were warm. Not the warmth of her gift. Or not only that. Something fuller. Something that had been building since a cold, rainy night in a small cottage at the edge of a village, when she had looked at a wounded wolf on her cot and felt, beneath all the discipline and the wariness, and the 2 years of careful not feeling, the first quiet certainty that something was beginning. It had not been easy. It had not been safe. It had cost her things she was still, in quiet moments, finishing the work of grieving. But she was here. Eden was here. The cottage in Ashfin stood, and the young curandera was training, and the laws had been rewritten, and the men who had catalogued her like property were answering for it in the slow, grinding, permanent way that justice actually worked when it finally arrived. And across the hearth, the Alpha King was frowning at a map of the northern borders with the focused patience of a man who intended to understand everything, and in a moment he would look up and find her watching him and say nothing, because some things between them had long since passed the need for words. She took a bite of bread. She was at last entirely home,